We have back with us tonight Paul Levy from Portland. We've had him twice before, and we always like to hear what he has to say about quantum physics and the TICO and the other things that he thinks about. He's quite a thinker and philosopher and experiencer. So thank you for coming back, Paul, and I'm just going to turn it over to you.
Well, great, thank you. I really appreciate the invitation. Thank you. So it was funny when Dottie had asked me a few weeks ago, can you write a description of what you want to talk about? And it was right after, I think, the assassination, the Soleimani assassination, and I was just so freaked out that I just, that morning, just wrote something about the apocalypse, because it felt very apocalyptic that we were potentially about to maybe go to war. And thankfully that hasn't happened, even though we've kind of covertly been at war with so many countries. But the archetype of the apocalypse is definitely activated in the collective unconscious. And so I kind of want to talk about that a little bit. I want to talk about what I've been thinking about. I'm in the middle of a new article, and what the article is about totally has to do with what's happening in the body politic of the world. And that is, it's basically pointing out that we as a species are having this psychotic break and this nervous breakdown collectively, in that the structures that are keeping us in our habitual patterns are breaking down. And that, where there's clearly this collective psychosis, and that our species is enacting on each other and ourselves. And I think, Jung has a great quote that, if I can remember exactly, in the article that I'm working on, he says basically we don't understand what's happening in the world. And he goes, what's happening is that the darkness of the unconscious of the soul is coming up. And then he just elaborates, and I'll paraphrase, that instead of this light from heaven coming down as the manifestation of the divine, that the light is coming up from the underworld in the form of darkness. And that's very apocalyptic, because the word apocalypse, I think we all know, has to do with something that's hidden, that's being revealed. And so the powers of darkness, basically, that are encoded within the non-local field are coming up and out, and they're not hiding in the corners or underground. But for all who have eyes to see, they're just, the powers of darkness are playing out all around us and inside of us, because they're non-local, through our reactions to the manifestation of the darkness. And so, and just to take a step back, then I was also thinking, God, what should I talk about today? Apocalypse, or the article I'm working on, where I quoted Jung, and that article really has to do with that the archetype of the shaman is activated in the collective unconscious. Because what is the shaman? In that, well, first off, Eliade, the great scholar who wrote the classic book on shaman, or one of the classic books on shamanism, basically defines the shaman as the anti-demonic hero, or maybe a champion, the anti-demonic champion, something like that. Don't quote me. And the idea being that the shaman archetype gets activated when the darker powers manifest. And the shamanic archetype also gets activated when they're in a particular individual, when there's this breakdown of the structures of the psyche. And that's getting acted out writ large on the world stage. And the shamanic archetype is something no one in their right mind would ever decide to do consciously. You'd have to be completely insane, as compared to just partially insane, in that the suffering that invariably comes our way when that archetype is activated is just, practically unbearable. The idea being that the figure of the shaman, and we're all shamans in training, that figure is called. It's called by whether you call it the spirits or some sort of higher dimension or from the unconscious. And one other way of talking about what catalyzes the shamanic archetype is when there's some sort of trauma or abuse or this wounding, because the shaman is the wounded healer. And when there's a wounding, all of a sudden, the wholeness of the psyche, I mean, think about it, we get traumatized and then we're out of sorts. And then we're disassociated. And I want to point out, if anybody is not disturbed by what's playing out in the world, then I would say then they're really disturbed. You know, the point being that we're a species in trauma. Okay, so all of these things are converging to catalyze the shamanic archetype. Now, so this is what I've been writing about, and the thing I should say too, when I like write about something, it's always stuff that's really alive in me. It's the way I work my process out. It's the way I become clear about it. It's the way I creatively express it or integrate it, or something happens when I, through like the writing, creatively express what's happening. Now, the shaman, the figure of the shaman, it's very, very interesting because, you know, there are a lot of aspects to the shaman, but if they're called and they don't assent to their calling, that's when they really get sick. That's when they can really go crazy. They can die really early. But if they assent to the calling, then all of a sudden the deeper powers that sponsor the calling all of a sudden start sponsoring the initiation in a way that can help the shaman to accomplish their ordeal. Now, the thing that's so interesting about the shaman, so it always catalyzes a descent into the unconscious, into the darkness of the unconscious, the place of demons and death and insanity, all of those things. But the thing that's most interesting to me about the shaman, the figure of the shaman, is that, just think about, like, if there's a particular shaman in a community, they'll work with one person who's sick or diseased in a certain way, and the shaman, because they're so empathic, will take on the sickness. And taking on has a double meaning. Taking on means to confront the sickness, like having it out with the sickness, but taking on also means to take within oneself. So that's what's interesting to me about the shamanic archetype, that the shaman, because there are boundaries between the conscious and the unconscious, and between themselves and the world, are so permeable that they will literally feel into and take on the illness of the person or the group or the community or the non-local field that they are, you know, doing their work with. And they take it on in such a way that they become ill, right? This is the archetype, this is the deeper archetype of the shaman. This is why it's equivalent to the healer who's wounded. Because the wounded healer is the shaman, and the wounded healer is the figure who, instead of avoiding their wound or trying to go around it, is able to carry it and experience it in a way that the wound becomes a portal to some sort of deeper healing where they can actually be available for people and help the healing in the field. And that is the shaman. So the shaman takes on the illness and becomes ill themselves. And in my article, I'm like contemplating, and then they somehow bring themselves back to health. Because if they stay sick, then that's a failed, whatever the initiation wasn't accomplished. then they're just in the same boat as the client who came to them, then they need a healer. But the idea, the archetype is like the shaman takes it on, becomes sick, and then brings themselves back to health. And how do they do that? What's that about? That's really interesting to me because we are in the roles of the shaman. We're not separate from the field, we're interfacing with the non-local field. There's clearly this out of balance in the field. There's clearly this insanity, there's something going on. We all sense it, whatever, whether you call it madness or evil or something. And then it's like, okay, what do we do? We're all affected by it because we're all interfacing and interconnected with the field. We're not separate from that madness. As a matter of fact, being a collective dream, we're part of the actual, the people who are dreaming up into materialization, the actual madness. It's not separate from our own inner state. And so, I was thinking, I can talk about that. And then I was thinking, well, I've spoken here a couple times about quantum physics. And quantum physics is so mind-blowing, and it so much has to do with what I'm trying to present tonight. And then there's also, I've spoken here about in the Native American culture, they talk about Watiko virus. It's a mind virus. And I wrote a book about that, how that is, it totally describes the collective madness, the collective psychosis that has overtaken our species and that we're acting out, all over the place, to the point where our species is enacting collective suicide. It's total insanity, and yet it's like seen as this normalized thing, and we just go about our day and all that. And meanwhile, we're a species gone mad. We're a species, suffering from collective PTSD, and yet what I'm pointing at is that one of the deeper archetypes that's activated in us is the archetype of the shaman, of the wounded healer. What's that about? And then I want to point out, then there's quantum physics. And if I can just say a few words about quantum physics, I won't go into it in detail because I've already spent the night here doing that. I gave a presentation a little while ago at a conference, and I basically presented that quantum physics in Tibetan Buddhism, just to take a step back, there's a tradition called Terma, and Terma is the hidden treasure tradition, and it's the way this particular, this tradition actually refreshes itself and proliferates and propagates and keeps itself pure, in the sense that hidden treasures are, from this tradition's point of view, are hidden, encoded within the fabric of the space-time continuum, and that are hidden in the higher dimensions, that basically are encoded within the fabric of the universe. And just like a dream, when we get one-sided and unconscious, a dream is a compensation of our process. So in other words, if we get asleep in a certain way, the dream will create a symbol that will help us to wake up, that will help us to get back in balance. Okay, that's what the symbols, which are the language of dreams, are. It's a compensation to help us get back to who we are. And what I'm pointing at is that that's the nature of this universe. And the Terma tradition, the hidden treasure tradition, is basically they really delineated and articulated how that works. That right at the moment when the community of practitioners gets a little bit off balance or in need of something, boom, they'll discover a treasure which will be like, do this practice, this is what you need to remember, or however. But it's not just a fairy tale. The scholars, the greatest scholars in the world, study this stuff, trying to understand, what is this about, this hidden treasure tradition? It's mind-blowing. Well, at this conference I spoke at a little while ago on, spirituality and science, I basically was presenting that quantum physics is a modern-day Terma, that it's a hidden treasure that's been encoded in the fabric of the universe, that we have discovered or has been, created, depending on what point of view, but it's like something is being offered to us, and it's only been out 100 or so years, but quantum physics can be seen as an analog, a modern day analog to, to a terma, that's actually this treasure. And what is it showing us? It is showing us that we are having a collective dream, because when you think about the essence of quantum physics, it's really complicated and convoluted. The essence of it is that the act of you observing the universe influences the universe you are observing. The act of observation is creative. That, in essence, is what quantum physics is revealing to us. Okay? That's mind-blowing. All this time we've been thinking that we're actually perceiving an objective universe that we're just passive witnesses to, and then we dream up quantum physics to empirically show us and prove to us that that's completely false. There is no objective universe. That the act of actually observing this universe is helping to co-create the very universe that you then think is separate from yourself. And then you react to it as if it is separate from yourself. So then it just reflects that back and manifests in a way that, is as evidence showing you that, oh, it really is objective. So then you get confirmed in your viewpoint of, I'm just, just reacting to what's actually out there. And what you've done is you've entranced yourself, you've bewitched yourself, you've put yourself under a spell by the creative genius of your own mind. And that's what quantum physics is revealing to us. That's what I mean that it's an analog of a terma. That's exactly the medicine we need. That's the medicine that heals Watiko, the collective madness in our universe. Okay? And what happens is that when somebody recognizes that and they connect with other people who recognize that, and they put their realization together and they contemplate, what are we discovering? This is unbelievable. If this is a collective dream and we haven't been aware of that, because that's what quantum physics is showing us, the dream-like nature. That's what all the spiritual traditions in the history of the world have been saying. And now the modern day, this wisdom tradition, quantum physics is basically revealing that through the medium of science. And what I'm pointing out is that, oh my God, as we actually have that realization and become in a way, these activists, quantum activists, and a whole lot of other people, I just want to get that term, not that I didn't make up that term, I'm just wanting to propagate that meme. It's a great meme, to become a quantum activist. Because keep in mind that quantum physics isn't this weird, mystical, esoteric thing. This universe is a quantum universe on every scale. We ourselves are quantum entities. Okay? So in other words, just taking it back on ourselves, how we actually are thinking about ourselves moment by moment instantaneously gets reflected through our experience, which then, if we're not awake to the creative power that we're wielding, we then entrance ourselves into a limited identity where we're not in touch with our creative power. When we begin to tap into the revelation that is quantum physics, the most incredible creative power that's encoded within us, within our psyche, gets liberated. And we realize we're creative beings made in the image of our Creator. And when you hang out with other people who are also having that realization, and you discover, oh my God, we're co-creating this dream together. And if you are actually understanding that and understanding how we can hang out with each other in a way to actually create this dream in a way that's more in alignment with who we're discovering ourselves to be, which is that we're not separate from each other, but we depend on each other for our own well-being. We're interconnected. That is to see through the illusion of the separate self, and that is to wake up. Okay? And that's what quantum physics is basically pointing at. That's what, the whole idea of the Watiko, this virus. And that's just a name. It doesn't, we can use any name, but that's connoting the collective madness, because just in mythology, when you find the name of a demon, you in a way take away its power. So the idea being, and if I can just now segue from quantum physics to Watiko, because quantum physics is the medicine for Watiko. What Watiko is, it works through the blind spots. It works through the blind spots of our unconscious, through the projective tendencies of the mind, so that We project onto the ink blot of the waking dream. We become entranced thinking that the actual reflection is objective. We become conditioned by that. And guess what? We've tricked ourselves out of our own mind. And to the extent that we're not awake, then we've fallen under the spell of Watiko. And then it even is more amazing, because then we actually have forgotten who we are. We think the universe is then objective, separate from us, which it's not. So then we think ourselves as being a separate self. Then we actually, don't know our place in the universe. And then we try to solve our problems by intervening in the outside world, like the problem is out there. When the source of the problem is in our own mind. See, what I just described is madness. And to the extent that we're not awake to the quantum nature, that's the affliction that has infected our species, okay? Now the thing is, it's not hard at all to have this realization. I think about in a dream, oh yeah, we can recognize we're dreaming, great, we're having a lucid dream. And I don't want to cast any spells, but I've noticed, at least in my process, it can be easy to forget, to absorb back into the forms of the dream. And that's where, in the idea of community, of Sangha, when you hang out with other people who are also awakening to the dream, however you describe it, the dreamlike nature, our quantum nature, the incredible creative nature, Buddha nature, Christ nature, it's all the same thing. When you actually tap into that and have the realization, wow, it actually is helpful when I hang out with other people in a certain way. That's the Sangha, that's the real spiritual community. And that certain way is we have a commitment to reflect back to each other when we fall asleep. And to support each other in our awakening. That it's not a competitive sport. It's like, oh, if you're more awake than me, then that's bad. No, who are you? If you're more awake than me, you're the awakened part of me. Wow, far out. That helps me. You see, it's cutting through that separate self, because the solution for the Watiko madness, which is, think about it this way, it's a psycho-spiritual disease of the soul that exists in the collective unconscious of our species from time immemorial. And it's a mind virus. And like I say, it operates through the way we perceive and through the way we project. And an example, say if you're in a night dream, right? And in the night dream, you don't realize you're dreaming. Well, if you change your viewpoint in that night dream, the night dream will instantaneously, in zero time, reflect back your change in viewpoint, giving you all the evidence that your viewpoint is outside of yourself, is objective, right? Because you don't realize you're dreaming. So you're holding a viewpoint, the dream, which is nothing other than a reflection of your viewpoint, just offers you the evidence confirming your viewpoint. You then think your perspective is correct, that you're just seeing objective reality. So you hold that viewpoint even more. The more you hold that viewpoint, the more the dream reflects and confirms and supplies all the proof and evidence of that viewpoint ad infinitum. That's the spell. And that's the genius of our own mind to create our reality that's getting boomeranged and turned against us, which is basically killing us. That's the malady that afflicts our species. That's what the Native Americans mean when they talk about Watiko. That's where quantum physics comes in and says, look, here's the elixir. Here's the medicine. Now, going back to that article about that we're all shamans in training. We're all these wounded healers in training who've gotten sick. There's a part of us, if we think that, oh, no, there's a collective madness, but I'm not mad. That part of you that thinks you're not mad, that's the mad part. We all have a little part that's mad. Jung himself said, he goes, it's really important to not be too healthy-minded. Okay? That he basically goes on to say we all have a mad part. And how could we not? We're like fish that are swimming in this collective madness that we are dreaming up. And that's dreaming us up in a circular feedback loop. So the idea being, as wounded healers and shamans, we then have fallen ill to the extent that we're not in our wholeness. And I'm totally talking about myself. I feel like I've been in a creative illness for 40 years. once my initiation happened, my life changed forever. And then the question of, okay, as the potential budding would-be shaman, wounded healer, when we take on, there's an age-old idea, the demon of sickness. When we take on the demon of sickness, and Jung actually talks about this. This is all in the article. You'll have to read the article, but he talks about, he goes, and he has different words for it, but I'm paraphrasing. He'll say, when you encounter this evil, he goes, if you don't succumb, no healing can ever happen. But he goes, if you succumb only in part, so in other words, you get infected, your boundaries are permeable, you take on the illness, and then it becomes an inside job. Then it's not outside of you, you've fallen ill, but you're experiencing it subjectively from the inside. And then Jung says, if you partially succumb, but then through the assertion of, you have to keep the little flame of your candle lit as the darkness is all around you, trying to swallow you. He's describing the shamanic journey. As you do that, and he goes, if you succumb totally, then what happens? Catastrophe. Then you're a goner. If you become fully possessed by that darkness, by that evil, by that demon of sickness, right? Then you're no good. You're not even good to yourself. How can you help anybody else? You're sick at that point. But if you actually succumb in part, and then finding the place, and now these are my words, where you're colluding, where, it actually, that demon, how you're actually feeding it through your unconscious reactions, that's in a way its blessing, it's showing you these unconscious parts of yourself. If you recognize that and find your agency, instead of just feeling like a victim, like, oh, I've fallen sick, and then you'll just become sick by the power of your mind. If you then start identifying yourself as I'm being sick, well, then your experience, because think about quantum physics, we are literally creating our experience moment by moment, and by the way we interpret our experience, by this meaning that we superimpose onto our experience. That's the power that we wield. I mean, that's what quantum physics, just for a second, goes back to. It basically says, you set up an experiment. How you set up the experiment, the questions you ask, how you interpret the data determines the answer you'll get back, right? So the questions we're asking, the meaning we're putting on the waking inkblot, how we're interpreting our experience is actually feeding into creating our experience. So that's very interesting to me, the sense that the shaman actually then, by partially succumbing, and then somehow metabolizing or infusing with light that demon of sickness, not only do they bring themselves back to health, but them doing that non-locally gets radiated out to the person and the community and the non-local field of the whole universe, and actually is helping to heal that every dimension of our experience. Jung tells a story of this beautiful story, very short, of there was a village and there was this they didn't have rain for there was this drought for many months or something, and they invited this person who supposedly was could help to make rain, this rainmaker. That's the title of the story, the rainmaker. And the rainmaker comes in and he says, all I want is a hut at the edge of the village, and don't bother me till I come out. And then after 2 or 3 days, there's a downpour, and then he comes out and the people ask him, what did he do? And he said, well, I got here and this land was really out of balance. So I felt really out of balance. So I just sat with myself until I got back in balance. And once I became in balance, then it rained. That's what I'm talking about. Okay? That's the archetype right there, is the image of the shaman. And that's who we all are. So to the extent we're able to carry our sickness, that part of us, that darker part, that neurotic part, that wounded part, however we characterize it, however we experience it, and to the extent that we're able to carry that in a way where instead of it then taking over us and us becoming its host, we then are able to infuse it with the light of our nature, which is wholeness, and integrated into that light. Not only do we bring ourselves back to health, but we even become healthier than before. That's the archetype, that is being offered to us. And how do we do that? How does that happen? Okay? And one of the things I've been thinking about is, because I see it in my own practice, because I totally relate to being a wounded healer. When people were first saying to me, "Oh, you're a healer," and I didn't relate to that word at all. But then when I discovered the wounded, I'm like, "Oh, I'm definitely a wounded healer," because I'm so in touch with my wound. And I actually wrote a 600-page book all about that, just the extent of the depth of my wound. And yet, somehow I've been able to carry it, that it's become a portal through which what I'm talking about tonight has somehow found, its voice through me. And to answer that question, how does the shaman do that? How does the shaman actually heal that sickness that they then have taken on? And the only thing that comes up for me, I think about my own experience. When I'm sitting with myself in meditation, and I feel my wound or my trauma or the darkness or whatever, however I would characterize that part of me that seems to be obscuring my light, I notice that at that moment there's like a choice that's being offered to me. And the choice is, do I actually identify with that? Because it's like a thought, it's a thought form, it's like this entity, or subjectively that thought form of that negativity, whether it's a negative thought, a trauma, a wound, unhealed abuse stuff, evil seeming energy, it's not separate from our consciousness. We're only experiencing it through the medium of our consciousness. And at that moment we have a choice. Do we actually think it's something other than us that we're like going to contract against because we're scared? Well, if we do that, that's investing it with power. Do we just immediately absorb into it? Oh, here's a negative dream. Oh, wow, I'm really depressed. Boom, we become identified with being depressed, and we will literally embody that reality. So do we contract against it? Do we absorb into it, become possessed? Do we identify with it? That's one choice. And that, for a lot of people, has become a habitual pattern. It's almost as if that's a habitual pattern in the collective unconscious of our species. But then the other choice is, do we recognize that in that moment of the arising of the sickness or the evil or the wound or the trauma or whatever you call it, however you experience it, do you recognize that that is nothing other than just a display in your mind, to your mind, from your mind? That it's just like the play of awareness. And at that moment, you actually let yourself experience that from the inside. You're not resisting it. You actually let it take you over. You let it possess yourself because you're not afraid of it. And by letting it possess yourself, what you discover, amazingly enough, is the part of you that can't be possessed. And that's the true nature. And that's like this mirror that whatever objects and however vile the objects you put in front of it, The mirror just reflects, that's its nature, effortlessly, and the mirror is never tainted or stained by whatever object, however dark the reflection is. The mirror is unchangeable. That's our nature. That's why all the wisdom traditions talk about our true nature as being like a mirror. And all the reflections are like the display in the mirror, but yet we identify with the reflections. We absorb in them, and that's to even absorb in on any moment. Say we're having an experience, oh, I am Paul, and I'm this identity, and oh, I have this body, and I feel my body, and all of that is just a moment-by-moment, continual, ephemeral display of awareness. And yet, how do we relate to it? Do we identify with it? Do we think it's real? Do we think it's separate from our awareness? Or do we just realize it's the display and play of awareness itself, and it's very spacious, that there's no problem. See, that's what the Buddha discovered in essence. The Buddha, who is the physician of the soul, who discovered the cure for what ails our species, for what, Tico, for this suffering. And what he basically discovered was that our situation is not problematic in the way we've been imagining it to be problematic. That ultimately, our situation is not problematic at all, in that when you discover that nature, that mirror-like nature, that space-like nature, that's already open-ended and free, that no matter what sickness or illness, that's not affected. And that once we have, in all the teachings, they basically say, once you recognize that, there's nothing to do. There's nothing to purify. There's nothing to transform. There's only one thing to do. And that's not get distracted, not forget. But then when you forget, to just like, oh yeah, have that forgetting be a prompt for you to remember, and then you're once again having the recognition. That's why in Buddhism, which I'm so familiar with, they talk about that the only thing that we don't need to do anything to attain Buddhahood. The only difference between a Buddha and an ordinary person is that the Buddha has the recognition of their situation. We all have the same situation. We're all totally equal. We have whatever you call it, the Buddha nature, the mirror-like nature, space-like nature, Christ-like nature, quantum nature, on and on and on. And what I'm talking about is not only remembering that and stabilizing that remembrance, but then hanging out with other people who are also remembering that, and putting our genius, the collective genius together in a way that we can only imagine, okay? Because quantum physics is pointing out that the potentiality of us, that we are immensely powerful beings, each one of us. But as if there's been like this enchantment or this spell, we as a species have fallen asleep to the incredible creative power that we're wielding. And that's what quantum physics has now, as a compensation, as a dream symbol, has come into our room, into the universe. And it's basically, when you look at it, you know, the way I'm trying to like shed light on it, this is what it reveals. That's what makes it a treasure. And it's available to each and every one of us at all moments right now, you know. And so then the shaman takes on the illness, and we are all the shaman. The figure of the shaman is activated in our collective unconscious. And then are we going to accomplish that process? And one of the practices that I found that really, really helps, I can talk about myself, my favorite topic, is that, you know, once this initiation began happening, the suffering for me was over the top. And it's been over the top, just, you know, nonstop, 24/7 for 40 years. And yeah, I'll sit in my spacious awareness, but there's a certain level of pain that I've always, that I seem to be very intimate with. And at first, I was completely committed, no, I'm committing my life to getting rid of this pain. And then fast forward a number of decades, and then I'm realizing, wow, maybe I might have to learn to live with this pain in a certain way. And that had never occurred to me because that was such a horrifying thought. And, but now what's happening, getting back to the practice that really helps, so say I'm feeling this level of pain, and I'm not going to go into the story, but it's just something I'm very intimate and very familiar with. And, and the problem for me, where it becomes problematic is if I identify with the pain. Then it becomes a big problem. And it's all through because one of the things that a lot of my work, and I'm not the only person who's pointing at this, is the profundity of the imagination, the creative imagination. That's really, when you realize this is a dream and you realize, wow, there's a certain potency I have, you discover you can tap into the creative imagination in a way that makes a difference, that really, really makes a difference. Not just in the ethereal, but in the actual physical too. So this practice, I'll talk about myself. I'm feeling this pain, and then I invoke my imagination. What if I could feel this pain really fully, really experience it as deep down as I possibly can? What if I were to do that, and then me doing that, no one else in the universe would ever have to feel this level of pain? Would I be willing to do that? Well, and there's one aspect of me that would, and it's the bodhisattva part of me, which is the bodhisattva. We all have that part of us, and the simple, my favorite sort of definition for bodhisattva is a being in the process of awakening. And who among us is not a being in the process of awakening? And when you begin to awaken, you begin to realize, well, we're not separate from each other, and that we're here to serve, that if I help you, it helps me, because you've seen through the illusion of the separate self. That's what the bodhisattva has understood and realized, and is then, embodying and incarnating. And so, yeah, there's a part of me that would be willing to really feel this level of pain. If by me feeling it, no one else would feel it, I'd be willing to do that. Now, keep in mind, I'm feeling the pain anyway, and I'm kicking and screaming, and it's problematic. But all of a sudden, just through my creative imagination, me thinking in that way, yeah, I'd be willing to feel this. So what have I done? I'm actually starting to embrace my present moment experience. I'm starting to just say yes to whatever I'm experiencing. And then guess what? Me being spacious like that, paradoxically, the pain all of a sudden isn't so bad because I'm not resisting it. And then by me welcoming the pain like that, keep in mind I'm feeling the pain anyway, this is all just an imaginal exercise, all of a sudden then I've gotten the added benefit that I've cut through the duality of seeing other people as separate from me, because I've just agreed to take on their pain out of my love and compassion. So that's an added benefit of seeing through the separate self. You see, there are three ways of dispelling Watiko. One is to see through the illusion of the separate self. Two is to see the dreamlike nature. And three is to see the field, the non-local field in which we're all contained and which is informing everything. That's why at certain moments are when the archetypal dimension of our process, when a really deep part of us is activated, all of a sudden there'll be the synchronicity that'll happen in the world. We're for that moment there's a fissure, and the seeming boundary between the inner and outer is just dissolved, and it reveals itself that our inner process is actually getting non-locally reflected and expressed via the medium of the outside world. That's one of the ways you see Watiko. Think about Watiko, this collective mind virus that's existing in the psyche, whose source is the psyche, which means in us, and it has a magic ability to somehow extend itself into the world and configure events in the world in such a way so as to synchronistically reflect and express what's going on inside of us. That's Watiko. When you recognize that, what is another name for that recognition? Oh my God, it's like I'm in a dream where the inner I'm recognizing is getting reflected through the outer. That's why Christ in the apocryphal text says, you enter the kingdom when you make the inner as the outer. See, all of this, all of the wisdom traditions from time immemorial are pointing at this. And then there's the Native American thing on Watiko, and then there's quantum physics. And all that I'm doing, I'm just a translator. I'm just saying, wow, look at this. They're all pointing at the same thing. And when you realize what they're pointing at, it unlocks something in us. So that's really inspiring to me, the idea that any of us, that all of us are being called to be a shaman. And keep in mind, if we say no, that's when we can really get sick. And a shaman in our own way, even if that means just being a good person or a good taxi driver, or it's not like you have to run out and be any sort of this messiah figure, not at all. It just means you actually are assenting to playing whatever the role that you're being asked to play. And you play it fully without identifying with the role. Now, here's another mind-blowing thing about quantum physics. So and where it plays into all of this, quantum physics basically is saying there are these quantum entities that don't exist until the moment that they're observed. And before they're observed, they exist in a potential, all the potential states they could ever possibly exist in. They exist in potential. And then, at the moment that some being observes that quantum entity, it actualizes into a particular materialization, and all the other potentialities, they disappear as if they never existed. Well, that's very interesting, because what they say next is even if one of those potentialities is, and this is a quote, highly, ridiculously unlikely, quantum physics is saying that could be the very world that manifests right at this moment. That is possible. Okay? That has implications that are mind-blowing, because what quantum physics is showing us, well, I'll just take a step back and say, one of the ways the malady, the illness that's infected us is showing up in us is people who feel despair and people who feel doomed. We're doomed. Just this sense of pessimism, of depression. I mean, what's going on in the world it's how do you even possibly understand and hold what's happening in the world? And so, if we fall into that, say, pessimism, we then view the universe through a pessimistic lens, and then the universe, being a dream, just reflects back in such a way so as to offer us all the evidence confirming our pessimism. So now we have the objective proof of our viewpoint, so we become even more entrenched in our pessimistic viewpoint ad infinitum. That's the feedback loop, whose origin is in our own mind, and we're using our incredible creative power to kill ourselves, okay? And I'm just describing what we as a species are doing. The evidence is all around us. And I just want to point out from the dreaming point of view, that's very interesting, that we are actually enacting collective suicide, because the question naturally arises, at least in my mind, why are we doing that? What is that about? Why are we actually unconsciously creating collective suicide? It's like we're enacting this ceremony, this sacred ceremony on the world stage in which we're destroying ourselves. How come we're doing that? That's an important question. And when I think about that, it's well, the only thing I can think of why we're doing that is to figure out how not to do it. Because we haven't clearly figured out how not to do it, or we wouldn't be doing it. You see, encoded in the pathology is the solution. That's what I'm pointing at in the collective madness, in Watiko, that encoded in the mind virus, in our collective psychosis, in the illness that we're all shamanically taking in and feeling sickened by, encoded in that pathology, encoded in that evil, encoded in that madness, not only is its own medicine, but is a blessing. That it's actually helping us to connect with our creative power, to wake up to who we are, and to recognize the dream. If Watiko didn't exist in this world, we would have to invent it. That's how much we need it, okay? But Watiko is a quantum phenomena. There's a superposition of states. It's like the greatest evil that can kill us. And it doesn't even exist. There's no such thing. It has no independent intrinsic existence separate from our own mind, which is showing us how incredibly profoundly powerful we are. So Watiko can kill us, or it can awaken us. It's a quantum phenomenon. Is light a wave or a particle? It depends how we observe it. It depends how we dream it. Is Watiko going to take us down or wake us up? It depends on nothing other than how are we going to dream it. Getting back to quantum physics, when they're saying, yeah, even if one of those potential states, the one that's the most highly ridiculously unlikely to happen, if it's within the realm of possibility, oh, that could be the next moment. Okay? And just think about that for a moment. Because then I talked from there, I went to the depression and the despair and doom and pessimism. Well, yeah, things don't look good. I think there's a French proverb I'll save. This is no time for pessimism. I'll save my pessimism for a better day. I think there's a phrase like that. Yeah, I think that's it. But the point being, you see, here's one of the ways Watiko works. Is that some people, who are really, spiritual, they're very identified with the light. They don't want to think about evil. They don't want to hear about Watiko, because they're thinking that, oh, well, if I think about evil, it's gonna empower evil. But what they don't realize, and yeah, there's some truth to that. If you think about it too much, it'll definitely, and if you become too fascinated by evil, then you are unwittingly feeding it. But if these New Age spiritual people who don't want to even hear about evil or Watiko, by being in avoidance of it, because Watiko feeds off of us looking away. It feeds off of our blindness, our psychic blindness. It's a form of blindness that thinks not only it's sighted, but thinks it's more sighted than the people who actually are clear seeing. Okay? And so, but if those New Age people turn away from evil and Watiko and don't want to hear about it or think about it or talk about it, they're unwittingly feeding the very darkness they're turning away from through their avoidance. And yeah, you don't want to become fascinated by it, that feeds it. What I'm pointing at is you want to see it. You want to see how this mind virus, whose source is the human mind, which non-locally explicates itself through the medium of the outside world. You want to actually see how it operates in the world. See when you see it, if you think, oh, that person has Watiko and I don't, well then that point of view shows you're under the thrall of Watiko, because it feeds off of polarization, which then, as soon as you otherize somebody, then there's fear, and it feeds off of fear. So you begin to see all the strategies and tactics of Watiko, and how it plays out non-locally, synchronistically through the outside world as it interfaces with their unconscious reactions in your own mind. You begin to discover how you're actually colluding with the very evil you're fighting against through your unconscious reactions. Okay? And when you begin to see, oh, now I begin to see that, then it's very interesting, because a couple things. Then you can begin to, instead of focusing your energy on Watiko or on evil, you can focus your energy on creating the world that we want to live in. See, that's the perspective, that's the healing, that's the cure for Watiko. Then Watiko it feeds off of our attention. But once we connect with other people who are envisioning a world in which we are recognizing that we're not separate, and we can connect with each other and dream ourselves awake, that's a world, that's what quantum physics, that's a world I want to live in, and that's what quantum physics is saying, that is in the realm of the possible. And that if we're not imagining that, then what are we thinking? So let me, I could go on forever. This is what I think about all the time. And, but anyways, let me open it up for any questions, or I could say more about a lot of things, but yeah. Yeah.
I have a question about quantum physics. And so when we imagine the most ridiculous possibility,
The most highly ridiculous?
the
Or,
most
yeah.
highly
Yeah,
ridiculous,
yeah.
then it can
Yeah.
come to life, right? And so you're saying that, but then also you're talking about how, to not look away from the darkness, right? But, to acknowledge it and to see it for what it is.
Right.
So how do we balance the idea of quantum physics and then immersing ourselves too much in that and manifesting, a certain reality, and
Right.
and acknowledging the darkness that is does that make sense?
Yeah. No, totally.
Because my concern is
Mhm.
that if we imagine the worst possibility, right, there's the idea of what's the best that can possibly happen versus what's the worst.
Yeah.
And so how do we manifest the best possible circumstance
Right.
for the highest and greatest good while still acknowledging the darkness that, wants to.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate that question. Yeah. So on the one hand, there's no getting around if people are, turning a blind eye to the darkness, then they're part of the problem. I mean, Watiko feeds off of, turning a blind eye. You don't want to become overly fascinated by it, that then the darkness has gotten into you and you're not, in touch with the heart, with your heart of compassion, which is your nature, But you see the darkness and then you basically come from the point of view, I am a sovereign being and I get to choose where I place my attention. And now that I see the darkness, that I've illumined the darkness with the light of my consciousness, now I can choose where I place my attention. And instead of, and the thing about that darkness, because, it's not just it's a collective dream, we're all dreaming. And, but what you discover when you see that is, instead of sort of externalizing and like thinking the problem is out there, when you're getting, because the darkness, and when we see the unconscious is a very simple way of saying it, the unconscious is like this, it's not a local, it's a non-local energy. And what that means, or one of the things that means, is if somebody is playing out the unconscious, and if you see it, there's no possible way you can see that without having your unconscious activated. It's non-local. See, it's not just out there. Seeing it activates it. Now your unconscious is activated. And so the point being is that on the one hand, you see the darkness and you realize, oh, the problem isn't there. The problem is it then non-locally triggers me. And you get in the habit of, whenever you get triggered by the darkness of the unconscious, instead of just, like a beautiful metaphor, my teachers use this metaphor, you have a dog and you throw a stick with the dog runs after the stick. If there's this lion, you throw a stick with a lion, the lion runs after you. Okay? And they say, be like the lion. So when something out there triggers you, when you see the evil, when you see the darkness, you get triggered. Immediately put your attention back on yourself. What inside of me, wow, what a blessing. There's something inside of me that was unconscious is now getting activated. So once you deal with that and integrate that to the point where you're not then like continually just at this mercy of, you're not just continually conditioned by external circumstances, but you found your center, yourself, right? I think of my teachers, they're just so incredibly at ease and non-reactive. That's the place they abide. Then, that being accomplished, then you're able to, okay, now, how would I want to dream this world? With the realization that I'm having that we're all not separate. And that if I love you and help you, I get as much benefit as you do. How do I dream? And so then you could focus your attention on that while still having that incredible skill of tracking the darkness. So you have both. Is that at all like helping?
No, totally. So it's free will that actually breaks the spell.
Well, that's the thing. You see, but that's such an interesting question, the free will question. Because when somebody is actually unconsciously identified with a content in their unconscious, say with a complex, right? So just to bring out a term, the idea that we've all been traumatized, so what happens in trauma, our psyche dissociates, and certain parts of those fragments become autonomous. And then the word for that is an autonomous complex. And the indigenous people, that's what they would mean by a demon. That's what a demon is. And an autonomous complex has a seeming like independent will and life of its own. And yet it actually ultimately is like, it's an expression of your wholeness that's just gotten severed and you've split, and split having the double meaning of both to dissociate and to leave. But that autonomous complex, which then informs our addictions or our habitual patterns, that's compulsive. That's the, there's no free will there, right? But it's only when you actually sort of integrate the demon or liberate the demon, and that liberating the demon, the image is like in that mirror, the reflections in the mirror. If you become identified.
A sub-personality?
Yeah, a sub-personality is another way of saying an autonomous complex. Right, that seems to be like having an independent, will and life and mind of its own, and totally. So, but the idea is so that mirror in the reflections, whatever's coming up, if you actually are in the condition of the mirror, then that the reflections, the thought forms, the seeming like traumas or addictive propensities just immediately liberate instantaneously upon their very arising, because you're not getting hooked by them. It's like the demon is wanting to hook you. But if you're really established in that condition of the mirror, then you're at the place of free will, because then you're not just compulsively like a marionette with strings. You're not just compulsively acting out some unconscious stuff, So that's the place where you go from just being compulsive to the free will. And interestingly, the compulsive, it brings to mind trauma, because what's the main quality of trauma is the repetition compulsion. And that's so interesting. So we get traumatized, and then we, in our attempt to try to heal from the trauma, literally recreate the very trauma we're trying to heal from. That's what trauma is. That's the pathology of trauma. But guess what? Encoded in that maddening activity is the solution. Because my favorite definition of trauma is unexperienced experience. We weren't able to fully experience the moment of trauma. It was so overwhelming. That's what trauma is. And so then there's the part of us that wants to actually consciously experience it, to integrate it. And so then we are unwittingly recreating it. And think about it, that's what happens in our lives. We're like, I see it again and again. I watch myself do it. That I will like literally dream up an iteration of my unhealed trauma again and again. With different people in different communities, and then I more and more understand, oh my God, I'm like dreaming this up so as to actually consciously experience it, so as to discharge it, so that it won't have the hold on me to impel me to compulsively recreate it. See, that repetition compulsion, that is the main thing of trauma. And it's that same quantum nature that encoded in the pathology is the medicine, is the solution. That's what I'm pointing at. In our madness, in the destruction we're enacting in our world, encoded within it is the most amazing like medicine and blessing. But we only get its benefits if we recognize what it's showing to us. And that's what my work is about. Okay? So I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I just want to say, as I'm talking about it, it's such a trip for me, because I was with Oliver today, he was driving me over, and he's like, so what are you talking about tonight? And I'm like, oh, I have like no idea. And I didn't. I'm really like, well, Dottie asked me and I said, oh, I wrote something about the apocalypse, and then she was like, what about quantum physics or Watiko? And I'm like, yeah, great, all sounds good. I had no idea what was going to come through me, but I just want to, sort of communicate, like do this meta communicating on my own state right now, because as I'm talking about this, like there are sometimes I'll give talks like this and I'll start crying. I mean, it's really embarrassing. It's totally mortifying, actually. It's not at all what I want to be doing. And then I would think about, and sometimes even in the talk I would realize, I remember the one talk, it happened a lot and I realized it, and what it is, because I feel this now, I feel this tonight, like, you know, I mean, I'm, you know, just trust me on this. I'm like, you know, just a completely ordinary person. Like I said, I wrote a biography about my process because it was so completely over the top, and I point out that I have this deep wound and the trauma. So the whole book, a 600-page book, is about my trauma and the wound, and it destroyed my family, and it almost killed me, and it drove me crazy, and the whole thing. And in the book, I talk about. I feel my subjective experience is that I'm operating at like under 1% of my capacity because I feel so unbelievably, you know, just, kind of, let's just say it was a shamanic initiation of a profound order, in that it was very, very difficult. And so I'm basically just saying, no, this what I'm talking about is nothing about me. But the feeling I have is, oh my God, more than anything, I want to get what I'm pointing out to the world. This is so profoundly important, what I'm pointing at. It has nothing to do with me. I didn't discover anything. Like I said, I'm just a translator. And so, you know, I guess I'm just giving voice to that, almost like a prayer, like putting out to the universe. Because, actually, I'm totally freaked out, and the last thing I want is like the idea of, you know, getting, you know, more fame, or, well, fortune would be nice, but fame type of thing. But, you know, because of just all the demands on my time, I feel I can so easily feel overwhelmed, because what's important for me is to do my practice and my creative writing. But so it's nothing to do about me. This has to do with what I'm pointing at, that this is something that if this gets out to the world, and once it gets sort of ignited in the collective unconscious, then it can like go sort of like in a viral way, and it can really change the collective unconscious of our species in such a profound way that's been unimaginable up until this moment, you know, because what I'm pointing out actually can do is to liberate the creative spirit in each one of us and in all of us, particularly collectively. You know, that's what, when I referenced before, we can dream ourselves awake. Just think about that. Instead of dreaming ourselves down and projecting the shadow and concretizing each other in our limited identity, and then the other person then embodies that and sees us in our limited identity, and we're both reinforcing and collaborating in keeping ourselves asleep and dreaming ourselves down into this larval, limited, fragmented identity, we can dream ourselves up and actually recognize who we all are. And the idea of, you know, activating that divine creativity that we're using anyway, but we're using it. For example, if somebody says, oh, I have no imagination. Well, your imagination is so profound that you're imagining something so far out, such as that you have no imagination. That's how powerful your imagination is. The point is that we, at this moment, have this incredible creative power, but we're not conscious of it. And then we're wielding it in a way that we're destroying ourselves. That's our situation as a species, okay? Should be front page headline, every newspaper on the world, okay? But what I'm pointing at is that when we actually have this realization, and we connect with other, because there are so many of us all over the world. That's why, being pessimistic, no, there are so many people who are awakening. And when you connect with other people and you realize, oh my God, we can activate the collective genius that isn't available just for me as my isolated self, but when we actually, it's a conspiracy theory. It's called, we can conspire to co-inspire each other. That's by conspiracy theory. And we can activate each other in a way that we can dream ourselves awake, and that's evolutionary, and that's what's been happening in our world is all about. So, yeah, I just wanted to say that, yeah.
So do you have some thoughts about seeing how this could be done, how this might be done, co-inspiring each other and actually starting to dream ourselves awake.
Yeah.
Have some thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts about that, and one thought is what we're doing exactly at this moment type of thing, but then also, you know, like it's so interesting how it brings up, like your question brings up this fear in me right away, because I'm like, oh my God, I'm only one person and I have limited bandwidth, and the fear is all these people placing all these demands on my time because I'm so busy anyway. But the point is that, I mean, that's just my own like disclaimer. The point is that connecting, like all of us have these imaginations, these dreams, these visions. And if there is a way of somehow connecting with each other in a way that, oh yeah, my vision, I have a new book that it's the companion volume to Dispelling Wetiko. It's called Dispelling Wetiko for Good, okay, which I think is a great title. That just came to me in meditation. And the idea being, oh yeah, it's a mind-blowing book. It would activate this, what I'm talking about. And meanwhile, I'm having trouble like publishing it, and so like one example would be like, oh yeah, well, stuff that you think, whether it's artwork or films or people who are doing work, saving, the fact that we're like extinguishing our species or destroying the biosphere. There are so many people doing amazing bodhisattvic work. And if we could actually, instead of being fragmented, if we can connect with each other and help each other and cooperate together, whatever that looks like, I have no idea. I mean, I do have an idea actually, but the idea being we all have our ideas, and how about creating a forum where we can actually materialize and incarnate and dream those ideas into incarnation? Because the idea, just one other thought, the idea, like I point out that people who are waiting for like the Messiah to come, that they're missing the mark, That's the real sin, which is the meaning, missing the mark is what the word sin means. That the idea is that we are the Messiah, that the God or spirit, whatever you call it, which is a conjunction of opposites, both light and dark, is incarnating through us, through the collective unconscious of our species. And we are the second coming. Because I point out in my work that quantum physics is the second coming. It's the Philosopher's Stone, the Holy Grail, the Pearl of Great Price. I mean, that's just one aspect of what you can talk about. There are so many of these treasures that are coming into our world, into our mind. And it's all like, the incarnation. And interesting, one of the things about the incarnation, think about when Christ incarnated. Who came on the scene as soon as Christ incarnated? There was Satan. Though the dark and the light reciprocally co-arise. That's not an accident when you see mythologically, symbolically. In the same way, and I see this in myself, the greater the light that I'm able to transduce, the greater the darker forces that I feel like are trying to stop me in my own mind and in external world in some way, but that's another story. But the point is that the origin of that is in my mind, or in my sight, or in myself, ultimately. And instead of like thinking that is problematic, like, oh my God, I'm feeling all this resistance and all these darker forces that are trying to like destroy me, I interpret it like, wow, I'm obviously on the right path, clearly, So it actually inspires me, and then it actually helps me even more further my bodhisattvic, like job of trying to help, because that's all of our vocation. That's, and I think we all know that, so, yeah. Oh, wait, okay.
Paul, I'm with a group, we're all over the United States and Europe mostly, that is now together putting out the vision of peace.
Right.
And this is something that is part of like what we're talking about that can help. Yes, we're very much aware of the dark part, and yes, we can see some of that in ourselves, but we're twice a day putting out the vision of peace.
Right. Yeah, that's beautiful.
Okay.
Yeah. And and that might be exactly the role that you and your group need to play, and just, my only edge, and I'm not saying that you're doing this, but I know a lot of, sort of spiritual people who just feel like, oh, if I just do my mantra and visualize peace, and then everything will be okay. And I point out, God, they're just missing the mark so deeply, because being a dream, their inner process is actually playing out through the medium of the outside world. So if you really want to get to peace, yeah, you get to peace inside of yourself, but you don't marginalize playing out whatever you can, enacting whatever you can in whatever activist way, whether it's as a quantum activist or a political activist or a spiritual activist, but you actually, have to participate in life. Yeah, there might be the few exceptional people who are just called to be hermits, to meditate in caves their whole life, but my only edge is like a lot of spiritual people who feel, oh, if I just meditate and send love and send peace, then it's all good. Yeah, and that's to just be deluded, because that's not to negate that. What about how are you going to participate or maybe that is all you need to do, but you just don't want to split off from that. In the same way that a political activist, they don't want to just be like doing all this great political activism, but from anger or from reaction, because then they're unwittingly feeding Watiko. They're unwittingly helping to strengthen the very thing they're reacting against. What I talk about is I call it spiritually informed political activism. It's like you have to cross-pollinate the spiritual understanding and being politically active, which is just meaning being a participant in the universe, in the greater body politic, which is what quantum physics is saying, is that we are participants, where this is a participatory universe. That's what quantum physics, in essence, is showing us.
So
Yeah.
Shelley, were you two?
Oh, okay,
There's Shelley
can't-
and
Yeah, okay.
Bo.
Well,
Yeah.
Oh,
No, I don't have a question.
Shelley
I'm
does.
scratching my head.
Oh, okay. Well, Bodhi, there's someone over here. 'Cause-
Shelley does,
Shelley,
yeah.
okay. And then we can get
Well,
you,
one of
Bodhi.
the patterns arising is like the empath and the narcissist or sociopathic, and that as a contrast of light and dark. And so, how do you see that? Because in traditional ideas, well, even energetically, the narcissist really doesn't heal because they don't have to. And so how
Yeah.
do you see that? Where the transformation come in, because a lot of the shamanic or the healers are natural empaths. So
Oh, totally. Yeah.
yeah, can
So
you
how do I
speak
see
to
the
that?
how do I see
as far
the
as the
healing coming out
transformation, do you
with
see
reference
the-
to what? With reference to that there are narcissists and sociopaths around?
Not in
or-
reference to our evolution, in reference to the narcissist dissolving, or
Oh, I see.
how,
Right.
this
Yeah,
greater
yeah.
possibilities taking
Right.
place.
Yeah, and I want to say, the narcissist thing really, really touches me really deeply, because I'm an only child and my father was a narcissist on steroids.
Mm-hmm.
He was a malignant narcissist to the max, and I had no understanding of that as a kid. I actually wrote an article about narcissism, and the guy who's considered to be, by himself, he outs himself as a malignant narcissist, he considers himself the world's expert on narcissism. He wrote me saying, how did you write that article on narcissism? How do you know that? And I just wrote him back saying, well, I studied at the feet of a master because of my father
Yeah.
was a narcissist, so I know.
Yeah.
And I know that one really well, the idea, I could describe narcissists to a T, but I know that, the prevailing theory of that they never heal. And I'm not necessarily, in disagreement with that. And that's it's just interesting, the whole pathology where you become so self-absorbed and you become identified with and protecting and defending an identity, yourself as a, separate self, that doesn't even exist. That is such a wild form of madness, And it is interesting that then you invoke, then there's the empathic person, and which, in a way they're like polar opposites, and because I know I have some friends who are like, professional empaths, and no, it's a super cool thing, and and they're just, that's another name for a shaman, and we're all empaths, we're all incredibly sensitive, but maybe some of us have gotten like traumatized that we've just shut that off. So I'm not even, sure if I'm answering,
So maybe how do you see that impact? How do you see the light dissolving or taking,
the light dissolving the darkness,
yeah,
like that, right? Well,
How
right.
do you see
I
that,
think of,
that dynamic
yeah.
disappearing?
Yeah. I think of
Yeah.
like there's Jung, who really clearly again and again and again talks about when you have the group think and you bring our, species together and they're very suggestible, that's, one of the major qualities of people, particularly when you bring them together. And then he says they basically develop an intelligence of like the lowest denominator of like this, he uses the word blockhead. The point being that when there's like a collective group of our species, there tends to be like, I almost see it as like an impenetrable bubble where they're reinforcing each other's like narcissistic point of view. But Jung then says that the way to transformation, the way of all of what we're talking about tonight is through the individual, that the individual person, so think about you then have taken on this darkness as the empath, as the shaman, and that darkness has a narcissistic quality. It's protecting itself. Keep in mind, this totally is what I'm talking about with Watiko. Before I found the word Watiko, I actually named it malignant egophrenia. And malignant egophrenia, ME disease, me disease. Okay, it's a misidentification of who we think we are. That's the narcissism. The narcissism, they're identified with themselves, and it's such a wild pathology. And you'll see where I'm going with this. If you think about it, we all have that residue of narcissism, where it's not even like we take on. It's not even like we're affected by what other people think about us. We're affected by what we think other people think about us, right? And the source of that process is our own mind. So, just the madness that we do to ourselves is so completely insane. So getting back to Jung, he talks about that the locus of the healing, it has to start in the individual, in each and any one of us. And when we then ingest, as the shaman, as the empath, that sickness, that darkness, that narcissism that's in the field, and then it like triggers something in us that has a resonant frequency, okay? Now, if we're not awake in that moment, we then absorb in that and identify with that and literally will become taken over by that negative energy. But the point being is that if we can then remember our nature, and our nature is just compassion and love and wisdom and like a mirror, like space, it's light. Then the images, that light just infuses that darkness over time. And I can easily imagine that darkness just more and more dissolving and dissolving into the light in such a way that the light actually becomes brighter. You see, that's what I'm talking about. The archetype is that the wounded healer, the shaman, takes on the illness, becomes ill, and brings themselves back to health, and even becomes healthier than before. Okay? They turn that poison into medicine. That's why in Tibetan Buddhism, they'll talk about with the poison, they say a real beginning practitioner needs to keep away from anything that's poison, right? The middle practitioner, they take the poison and make an antidote out of the poison to heal themselves. But the advanced practitioner, what do? They eat the poison. And they say it's like a peacock. I didn't know this, but when peacocks eat poison, the colors of their, whatever this, plumage becomes even brighter. Yeah. So anyway, I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, I think it's just great. You just explored it, and that's great. Thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah, for sure.
Anybody else
Do
have a
you
question?
have
I
any?
just-
Yeah.
So it sounds like basically we're all engaged in a collective soul retrieval. It sounds
Right?
like.
Totally.
And so we each have a piece of the oversoul, or however we want to view it, right? And so maybe even the idea of the empath and the narcissist is that's creating the alchemy and the friction for the empaths to light up for however much they engage with that. And so the narcissist maybe even provide the elixir, right, for how
Right.
hot the oven gets. But I guess my question is too, is that so each of us has a piece of that collective soul retrieval, right?
Yeah.
And so then the recognizing the Watiko and just even like, because I think about it too, is that there are women marching, there are people, being active, but we can do this in our day-to-day lives, right? Like say we're in the grocery store and somebody's kind of rude to us. We can acknowledge and just be like, instead of yelling back, right? We can go in with ourselves and say, "Oh,
Yeah.
that feels like somebody's in pain," you know, and then recognizing that, and then saying, okay, like how can I honor that pain, you know, how can I, and so I guess I'm just kind of looking for ways to kind of bring that more into day-to-day life, right? Because I think when we see, I mean, even when you talk about Wetiko, it feels like it's like a heavy weight, right?
Yeah.
But how can we dispense it in like small little moments and just you know, acknowledge it and then send it to the light? Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
So
Can I give you an example of what
Yeah.
comes up for me? Because I appreciate that, because, you know, this can all sound really, you know, great and inspiring, but very abstract and esoteric and like, okay, but what do we do with it, you know? And I think the biggest chapter in the quantum physics book is just like quantum physics in everyday life. Because it's completely, our lives are quantum in nature, and this is really going to, I think, maybe shed light on your question. We're, you know, at each and every moment, we're like these quantum entities that are pulsing in and out of the void every nanosecond, recreating ourselves anew, right? But to the extent that we're in trauma, we solidify each other. You know, we concretize. So each other's fluid, multidimensional hologram will like see them as a particular way, and then we'll react to them in that way. And then we're not causing them to manifest in that way, but if we're seeing them in that way, we're making it more probable that out of all the potentialities, that's the way they'll manifest. And as soon as they manifest in that way that we're seeing them, that confirms to us that is who they are even more, so then we even more solidify them, and that process happens over time and in no time, simultaneous. So here's the example. So I remember years ago, I was in this relationship with my girlfriend, and we broke up. And we were, you know, still in the same house together. We were living together. But I was about to move out, but I was still there, and it was the morning, and I was asleep. She had woken up, and she wanted to ask me a question, but she was afraid of the answer I was going to give. You know, and so when I'm asleep, and she woke me up, and I somehow remembered this. You know, in the moment, I was aware of what was happening. She literally woke up the part of me that wasn't going to give the answer that she wanted. So that's the part of me that woke up. And I then gave her the answer she didn't want, which then, I'm imagining, confirmed to her, damn it, I knew Paul wouldn't do this. So then she's even more confirmed in her perspective of who I am. But what that moment, and I tripped out on that moment, like, wow, that was so interesting. Because I saw the part of me that would have happily had given her what she wanted. But she didn't invoke that part of me, you know? And so that's a sense of, particularly with people who are in conscious, sort of like having relations with, just our spiritual friends, or our partners, or, you know, there's people who we really can be authentic with. It's a very interesting thing to inquire into, how are we dreaming ourselves up? Like, I'm always interested whenever I'm with someone, like I have a private practice, and when I work with someone, or in my groups, I have all these groups all throughout the week, and I'm always interested, like, wow, how am I getting dreamed up in the group? What is the role I'm getting dreamed up in? You know, which is clearly the perfect sort of identity for me, and I'm clearly getting dreamed up in a role of somebody else. And even to make it more specific, to the extent that I have an unhealed abuse stuff, and we all do, to the extent that we're not fully whole, well, you know, and I was so blown away when I learned this, that when, you know, like an unconscious trauma is at the point of being ready to be healed, that's when the repetition compulsion gets even more intense. So it seems to be like, oh my God, my problem is getting worse. That's actually a sign it's becoming conscious. And the way to think about that is that when my unhealed abuse is coming up and starting to be available to be healed, then all of a sudden I'm going to be dreaming up unconsciously. I'm going to be connecting the dots on the waking ink blot to dream up, to enact my abuse. And typically I will either dream up somebody else to play the role of the abuser, so I can like then be the recipient of the abuse and experience that part. Or there are lots of times where I somehow dream myself up into the role of the abuser as my way of integrating that role that I've kept projected out. But the point being is that when somebody is at the place of being ready to heal their abuse, you might find yourself getting cast in the role of the abuser. And from our ego, that's like not what we want. Oh, I don't want to do that. I don't want to, and I'm talking subtly, energetically. But if you realize as you're getting cast in the role of the abuser, and if you recognize, oh my God, they're actually recreating their unhealed process. They're dreaming, they're unconsciously reenacting the very process that has been inside of their mind in their unconscious that they haven't been awake to. Because think about, okay, anything in our unconscious, this is, Jung like says this in so many ways. He says, the unconscious approaches us from outside of ourselves. Think about it, you're unconscious of something, you're identified with it. You can't see it because you're identical with it. It's invisible to you. So we start to like literally project it out, dream it up, it will appear out there, and we can like react to it and become conditioned by it up until we recognize that, oh my God, it's that part of me, that I'm looking in a mirror. That's when we begin to own that part. So in other words, here I'm just giving like, this long-winded answer, but the idea being that, yeah, to the extent that any of us are unhealed, we are literally recreating our wound and our trauma. And when the person outside of us can see that, or when we can see that, that's where we can really like get our hands in and in a way, get our hands into the trauma in a way where we can actually like heal it and reintegrate it and really heal it. And that's like an everyday life, that's not an esoteric thing.
Time is up. So thank you, Paul.